Hello, Manhwa lovers. I hope you're all having a great day. I want to start by thanking everyone who commented on the last video. Your support keeps me motivated to keep uploading more content. A special shout out to Cedric Shepherd 4459, who was once again the first to comment. Now, let's dive into the summary. Our story begins on a deserted mountain at dawn, with our protagonist climbing up, visibly exhausted and carrying a bag. He looks up for a moment and starts laughing as he recalls a picture he saw online, an image of a man talking about tofu next to a tree. He then explains that he had climbed all the way up to cleanse his inner corruption. Carefully analyzing the tree, he notes that it has the perfect proportions and an almost divine appearance. To him, it was the best tree, perfectly suited for a good cosplay. At 24 years old, he was probably the only person who would think of a tree as sacred. He wondered if he should really go through with it, but he needed a little extra help to remove the chalice. So, he played a video of a mass on his phone to set the mood. With the cold morning breeze and a distant view of the city, the purification began. In the video, a girl's soul was being intensely purified. Our protagonist mimicked the same movements, determined to read the Bible properly. In his mind, performing this kind of ritual made him feel like the main character, as if he were connected to the world beyond. He reached for the holy water to complete the purification and removed the chalice just as the video ended. However, the realization of what he had just done hit him. His actions suddenly felt ridiculous. Deciding to shake it off, he packed up and headed home to play video games, remembering that it was the first day of his final semester of classes. As he left, the tree began to move strangely. Jumping to the present, a little girl stood in front of his door, pointing at him, demanding that he take responsibility for her mother. She had small horns and green hair. For some reason, his body wouldn't respond. He felt as if an abyss itself was staring at him. The girl asked if he understood and wanted to know why he had to get involved with her mother. Our protagonist was completely lost. That thing from that morning was her mother. He tried to make sense of what had happened back then. As she began to smile, he felt his consciousness slipping away, as if he were falling. When he regained awareness, a window appeared before him, displaying his name, Lee Si-hyun, and congratulating him for being the first candidate for marriage. His eyes snapped open, and in that instant, he instinctively realized the truth. He let out a desperate scream. He had unknowingly performed a ritual with the world tree and ended up in this world. There were only a handful of world trees in existence. They extended beyond the void, protecting the worlds born from their roots and watching over them like a mother nurturing her children, guiding them toward unity. The land where he now stood, RH2, was a world that had never hosted a world tree. However, a young world tree had taken an interest in planting itself there. The problem was, he had accidentally purified it. All of this information flooded his mind the moment he opened his eyes, as if it were basic knowledge he had always possessed. Ever since he had purified that tree behind the mountain, only to discover it was a world tree, it all seemed almost laughable. But he had to face reality. This was no time to joke. After years of hard work, climbing to the top of his department's rankings through sheer determination, he was now being forced to marry a tree. The system notification informed him that the purity of the world tree was quite delicate, but he didn't care about that. Ever since arriving in this place, this so-called pure world tree had been talking to him as if they were on a holographic video call. He asked if there was any way he could return to Earth, but deep down, he felt no certainty about it, just an unshakable intuition. The system window merely responded with an emoticon, leaving him even more confused. Lee grew even more frustrated. He wanted a direct answer, whether from the world tree or whatever force governed this parallel world. He demanded to be sent back to his original world. In response, the system coldly informed him that as a candidate for marriage with the world tree, he had to prove himself worthy and become a valuable person. But he had no interest in any of that. This was his final warning. He had no choice but to take on this mission. Lee asked what would happen if he refused. The system window informed him that he would receive the worst punishment imaginable. That thought unsettled him for a moment. It seemed ridiculous, yet he questioned whether he had ever felt such helplessness before in his life. Immediately, he asked what his quest was, wanting to hear it one more time. His primary mission was titled Different from the Seed Leaf. He was a stranger who had drifted into this world. Escaping was out of the question. However, he was considered a suitable candidate to become the world tree's husband. To prove his worth, he had to graduate from the academy. Lee had no idea what the academy was, yet the system insisted he had to graduate from it. His reward? the love of the world tree. If he failed, something or someone would come for him. The countdown had already begun. 120 days, 59 minutes, 53 seconds remaining. In sheer desperation, Lee screamed in protest, but the system window simply confirmed his fate. He couldn't understand why he was deemed husband material in the first place, and if he failed, he'd end up buried underground. A surge of anger overtook him, but he saw no point in resisting. The system seemed to be telling the truth. And if that were the case, then the consequences of failure were likely real as well. Panic began to set in, but he knew he couldn't just sit idly by. He powered on his computer. If he didn't want to end up 6 feet under, he would have to adapt, fast. His research revealed this world was filled with hunters, heroes, dungeons, and villains. It reeked of fantasy. Among his findings, he came across the concept of a tree man, a tree that took on a humanoid form. There were also sacred trees, special beings that coexisted with magic and swords in this world of fantasy. He had a feeling this would be a fruitful year. The system prompted him to create his character, making him pause to think. It explained that his abilities in this world would be reflected in his stats, much like a video game. He had 100 points to distribute. This essentially turned him into a video game character, an area he was well versed in, considering how much time he had spent playing games. He didn't know how long he would be stuck in this world, but if he wanted to escape his fate, he needed to prioritize late-game power. His plan was start weak, grow strong later. He wanted certain items, but his points were limited. That meant he had to sacrifice basic stats in exchange for unique abilities, a fundamental strategy in games. But even then, he felt it wasn't enough. So, he sacrificed his appearance in exchange for better abilities. The system window seemed saddened by this, but Lee explained that stats mattered more than looks. He invested in high-potential stats like luck, ensuring his late-game-oriented build was complete. He gained some advantages, but also received several penalties in return. Risk was unavoidable. After all, with great power comes great responsibility. The system asked him to confirm his choices, while the window hesitated, urging him to reconsider. But no matter how much she pleaded, the response remained the same: yes. A beam of light surrounded him, and suddenly, his body felt much heavier. However, when he looked in the mirror, he appeared the same. He had imagined severe obesity would make a visible difference, yet nothing seemed to have changed. He assumed he must look different to others, but that was irrelevant now. He asked the system window, which still looked sad, whether he could lose weight through exercise. He also added that what truly mattered was the inside, not appearances. Checking his computer, he found that 100 days remained until the Academy's admissions. That became his new primary goal. He would train until then. The World Tree wished him luck, calling him her husband, which left him stunned. Still, he was secretly pleased. He felt like he had struck back at the World Tree that had ruined his life. He decided that tomorrow he would start training. By the 13th day, Lee was exhausted due to his severe tendency toward obesity. He had wanted to give up multiple times, but if he wanted to enter the academy, he needed to increase his stats as soon as possible. He had no other choice. His life would be over if he failed. As he worked out, he overheard people whispering in the distance. "Even goblins aren't that ugly," someone muttered. Another person compared him to an image they had seen online, an orangutan. Although Lee had willingly made this sacrifice, knowing his ugly face was the price for his stat bonuses, he couldn't help but feel furious at the girls mocking him. He couldn't understand how they could laugh at his appearance so openly. His uncontrollable rage disorder was triggered. In the distance, a girl with a confident aura sipped her water. She heard the commotion and turned around to see what was happening. The moment her eyes landed on Lee, she couldn't help but notice how incredibly ugly he was. Lee demanded an explanation. Why hadn't they done anything to help his ugly face? One of the girls told him to stay away, claiming he smelled awful. Curious, he asked if it was because of his philtrum. He ran his fingers across his face and sniffed them. A horrible stench filled his nostrils. He asked what had happened to his philtrum, but the girls didn't seem to understand what he meant. Angered, he grabbed a rock and began shouting, frustrated that they had ruined his day. To Lee, being ugly wasn't a problem, but being mocked for it was. Just as he moved toward them, a firm hand grabbed his shoulder. A voice warned him, "Making noise in public places is forbidden." It was security. The guard instructed him to follow her, while the two girls used the opportunity to run away. The officer scolded him. "This is the 7th time you've done this." She warned him that if it continued, he would be banned from entering. This time, Lee had actually tried to hit them with a large rock. He excused himself, saying that he had trouble controlling his anger that day. The officer didn't buy it. She had heard that excuse from him too many times. It was his own fault. Lee apologized, promising never to return to the park. What had happened that day was nothing new. Every time he went to the park, people would stare and laugh. At first, he had tried joining a gym, but they wouldn't even let him apply. The trainer pointed to a rule that stated he couldn't distract other members. Lee didn't understand why. He always made sure to wash himself properly. The trainer simply placed a mirror in front of him. When he looked into the mirror, it shattered into pieces. The next day, a news station arrived to report on the man who had broken a mirror with his face. He began to wonder if being ugly was a sin. The World Tree of Purity reassured him with a smile, saying that it still loved him. To him, that made no sense. A month had passed since then, and his weight had dropped from morbid obesity to a 2-digit number. Lee checked his stats and felt satisfied with his progress. Then he noticed a small shopping cart icon in the top right corner. Curious, he wondered what it was. The system window informed him that the World Tree auction was available only to the World Tree's husband or its chosen candidate. It was a currency created by the World Tree and as a way to express their affection. He was stunned to learn that affection could be converted into currency. When he asked how much he had, the answer was 100 units. That amount seemed incredibly small to him. He still didn't quite understand what the World Tree of Purity was. He thought it might be related to the ritual he had performed on the mountain. The question lingered in his mind, but he soon brushed it aside. Instead, he wanted to know what he could spend his points on. The system window displayed multiple options, but Lee's attention was immediately drawn to one word: gotcha. The moment he saw it, he couldn't contain his excitement. He spent all 100 points and received his first item, a bottle of water. The second item was seedling fertilizer. To his surprise, the items actually appeared in front of him. The next item was a patience mask. If he wore it, his attractiveness stat would increase to 2, and every 5 days, it would go up by 1 point. He paused to think for a moment. His attractiveness was currently -2, so this would help him gain 4 points over time. It seemed useful, so he decided to keep going. After 30 minutes, his inventory was filled with more bottles of water, a new trait called combative body, and 3 arborea orbs. He wasn't sure how they could be useful, but giving them away would be a waste. For now, he decided to keep them. Since he had lost weight, he figured it was a good time to buy some new clothes. At the shopping mall, Lee wore the mask he had just won. He was already getting used to this world. He entered a store, looking for trainer outfits. As he browsed through the clothes, he reflected on how, despite this world lacking his family, his hometown, and his favorite game, everything still felt oddly familiar. Sometimes, he felt like he was in a giant prank, like something out of the Truman Show. When he first arrived in this world, he had been given 1,000,001, but now he had almost nothing left. Still, he figured he could afford to spend a little more since, once he got accepted into the academy, he would receive a stipend. However, he also worried he might go hungry before then. Before he could look at more clothing options, a sudden shout echoed through the store, something about a sacred tree. Apart from the chat tree, he hadn't seen any other special trees in this world. Curious, he decided to check it out. He squeezed through the crowded group of people blocking his view. When he finally got a glimpse, he saw someone with a commanding presence. He wondered if this person was really a sacred tree. She walked as if she were on the cover of a fashion magazine. Lee blushed slightly upon seeing her. Their eyes met, and suddenly, he had a vision. She was wearing a cosplay outfit, standing in front of a mighty oak tree. From that, he deduced that this must be her tree name. She walked up to him and called his name. His mind raced. What was happening? The woman smiled and said, "You seem to have something interesting." The scene shifted. Lee now found himself inside what looked like an office. Confused, he asked, "Did I do something wrong?" He had been summoned to a place he didn't even recognize. Silence filled the room. The woman was certain he was wondering why she had called him, even though they had just met. He feared she might be about to scold him for being ugly. Another thought crossed his mind. Once she moved her legs, he would be able to see her cosplay. She stood up, intrigued, and stared at him intently before starting to move. She approached him until she was standing directly in front of him, then leaned down to get a closer look. Placing her hands on the table, she exuded confidence, fully displaying her personality. Lee immediately blushed. She seemed to sense something. The chalice was beginning to appear. Smiling, she asked what he was looking at. He quickly apologized, but she tilted her head and asked why he was apologizing. "There's no reason to get shy," she added. Lee realized she was teasing him, and enjoying it. The woman then asked for his name. She had already noticed his mask and knew that there were many unique people like him, but then she asked if he had something for her, something called arborea orbs. Lee immediately understood that she was referring to the ones he had obtained from the gacha. Luckily, he had kept one just in case. He assumed that if he gave it to her, she would offer him money in return. Instead, she simply asked him to hand it over. That confused him. Lee admitted that he had no idea what it was, but she told him not to pretend. She could smell it on him. Tree people were much more sensitive than humans. Lee confirmed that he did have it, but he still didn't understand why it was important. The woman was shocked that he had brought something like that without knowing its true value. For tree people, arborea orbs acted as growth accelerators. They allowed babies to mature into adults almost instantly. She needed them for her children, the Oak family. Lee vaguely remembered hearing about the Oak family before, but he still didn't know much about this world. From what he understood, tree people were born from the world tree's seeds and were regarded as nobility across different regions. Since this woman was a noble, Lee realized that if she didn't like him, she could easily get rid of him. Her sharp gaze made it clear that she had no intention of spending even a single coin. Lee didn't like being in this situation. The woman made him think. He really didn't want to make an enemy of the Oak family. However, he also couldn't just let her walk all over him. So he pulled out the item and held it up, wanting to confirm if this was what she was looking for. She leaned in closer, inspecting it carefully. The moment she confirmed it was the real thing, she reached for it. But before she could take it, Lee snatched it back. "Wait," he said. Confused, she asked, "You're not going to hand it over?" Lee explained that he still had two more and planned to get even more in the future, so stealing it from him wouldn't be in her best interest. Instead, he suggested making a deal. That was a lie. However, if he played the gacha, he might actually be able to obtain one or two more. The woman mocked him. "If you had just kept quiet, you could have held on to the rest," she said. Lee realized he had acted too hastily. The way she spoke, it was as if she had never planned to make a deal in the first place. If this continued, he was going to get robbed. He tried to think of something, but she interrupted him, noticing that he regretted talking too much. She had the expression of someone who enjoyed playing with people. She only wanted to take the arborea orb. Nothing else mattered. As she smiled confidently, fully displaying her personality, Lee grew furious. At that moment, a notification appeared. He had triggered a subquest. He had 30 minutes to perform a religious ceremony with the tree person. If he failed, he would be eliminated. Lee's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and fear. The absurdity of the mission overwhelmed him. He looked at her again, and suddenly, new instincts began to emerge, helping him understand the sacred texts better. Lee asked to step into another room to think. He needed time to analyze his options. She assumed he was having trouble controlling the chalice, so she told him to return once he had cleaned it. That set off his anger issues. Lee stopped walking. Slowly, he locked the door behind him. She had no idea what was happening, but Lee smirked. "I'll teach you," he said. He grabbed her by the shoulders and explained that this was a common practice among religious people. Then, without warning, he snatched one of the small cakes she was carrying. The woman gasped in outrage. "You're acting without a proper reason," she protested. "This will make you an enemy of my family." Lee sighed. She talked too much. He decided to silence her himself. As he removed his mask, the room fell into complete silence. The woman's face paled. And then, she vomited at the sight of him. Lee grabbed her again, forcing her to face him directly. He stared into her eyes, preparing himself. Then, without hesitation, he leaned in to kiss her. She froze, utterly shocked by what he was about to do.